Mexico, the land of the serpent and the eagle. If the annals of history have taught us anything, it is that destiny delights in paradox. There is no land so richly endowed with the blessings of nature, yet so relentlessly battered by the storms of history, as Mexico. Its valleys, once the cradle of empires, have witnessed triumph and ruin in equal measure. Its mountains, ancient sentinels of time, have ignored conquest as savage as they were inevitable. The soil upon which its people tread has been stained with the blood of warriors, rebels, and tyrants, each convinced of his own permanence, each quickly reduced to the dust of forgotten ambition. The history of Mexico is not merely the chronicle of a nation, but the eternal drama of empire itself, its rise, its decline, and its inevitable fall, followed by the equally inevitable struggle to rise again. From the towering pyramids of Teotihuacan, whose silent stones mock the transience of human endeavor, to the mighty halls of Tenochtitlan, where an empire built on blood was consumed by it, the land has never lacked rulers nor revolutions to overthrow them. The gods of Mexico, whether ancient deities appeased by human hearts or modern rulers appeased by empty promises, have always exacted their toll. It is the bitter irony of history that those who claim the mantle of civilization are often its greatest destroyers. The Spanish, who justified their conquests with the rhetoric of salvation, brought pestilence and war under the guise of faith. The priests, who condemned the human sacrifices of the Aztecs, oversaw their own rituals of destruction, baptizing entire peoples in fire and steel. Yet if Mexico's conquerors were ruthless, their spirit was indomitable. For every empire that fell, a new order arose. For every tyranny that gripped its throat, a rebellion responded in kind. And so the cycle of power endured, an unbroken chain of ambition, violence, and renewal. The history of Mexico, then, is not the mere sum of its wars and rulers, but rather a testament to its own endurance. It is a land where men have proclaimed themselves emperors, only to be dethroned by those who once applauded them, where revolutions have been fought in the name of freedom, only to erect new forms of despotism. It is a land where fate plays cruel tricks, where the visionary is often sacrificed on the altar of his own ideals, and where the dream of progress is forever shadowed by the specter of its own ruin. And yet, despite it all, or perhaps because of it, Mexico endures. Like the eagle on its flag, it perches on a cactus of its own history, devouring the serpent of its own misfortunes. The past, that cunning craftsman of fate, has bestowed upon it both wounds and wisdom. Whether it will learn from them or repeat them again, only time will tell. But if history has a lesson for those who presume to rule it, it is this: Mexico does not bow to any conqueror for long. Long before the first European ships cut through the waves of the Atlantic, before the banners of Spain were unfurled in conquest, and before the very name of Mexico was spoken in the courts of kings, there existed a world whose grandeur rivaled that of any civilization history has deemed worthy of remembrance. It was a land of stone and sky, where pyramids rose in defiance of time, and where men, in their ceaseless ambition, wove empires upon the fabric of the earth. These were not the nameless hordes of barbarism that some later chroniclers, blinded by their own prejudices, would suggest, but rather nations of science, of order, and of blood, peoples whose wisdom astonished their conquerors and whose downfall, like that of Rome, was written in the fatal ink of their own divisions. Of these ancient civilizations, the Olmecs were the first to carve their legacy into the face of time. Mysterious Enigmatic and veiled in the shadows of antiquity, they sculpted colossal heads from stone, as if to challenge the heavens themselves to remember their dominion. It was they who laid the foundation for all that would follow, the first architects of Mesoamerican civilization, the progenitors of rituals, mathematics, and celestial calculations that would bewilder even the most learned minds of Renaissance Europe. Yet, like all empires, the Olmecs were not immune to the inexorable march of decay. Whether by famine, invasion, or the slow erosion of their own vitality, they fell, leaving behind a legacy not of power, but of influence, as their knowledge seeped into the cultures that would rise in their stead. It was in the city of Teotihuacan, the place where the gods were born, that the full majesty of Mesoamerica first reached its zenith, a metropolis whose size dwarfed all but the greatest cities of its age. It was an enigma even to those who later walked its ruined avenues. Here, beneath the imposing shadows of the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon, a people unknown to us by name forged a civilization that would echo through the ages. It was not a city of warriors, nor a kingdom ruled by a single hand, but rather a vast and ordered society, a beacon of trade and spiritual dominion whose gods demanded sacrifice in exchange for the secrets of the cosmos. Yet, as with all such beacons, its light would one day fade. Fire and chaos consumed Teotihuacan, its temples blackened by the same flames that had once burned in offering to its deities. Whether felled by invasion or its own internal unrest, the city collapsed, leaving behind only ruins and riddles for the ages to ponder. The Mayans, heirs to the intellectual grandeur of their ancestors, took knowledge and civilization to heights that should have defied their eventual collapse. They measured time with an exactitude unknown in medieval Christendom. They charted the heavens with an accuracy that would shame their European conquerors. And they built cities of towering pyramids, where kings, adorned in the feathers of the Quetzal, ruled with divine authority. Their society, vast and complex, stretched from the Yucatan to the highlands of Guatemala, a network of warring city-states locked in a perpetual dance of conquest and betrayal. Yet it was not foreign invaders nor steel-clad warriors that undid them, but the slow suffocation of their own ambition. Whether through overpopulation, ecological devastation, or the endless wars that drained their strength, the Mayan world crumbled, its cities swallowed by the very jungle from which they had first emerged. Then, from the desolate north, there came another people, the Toltecs, who would forge a new era from the ashes of the old. Warriors and builders, dreamers and destroyers, they fashioned Tula, a city of columns and pyramids, and ruled with a might that made their names synonymous with civilization itself. They worshipped Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent, the god who would one day return, though whether to bless or to punish, none could say. Yet, like all those before them, the Toltecs too would fall, their empire swallowed by the same cycle of chaos and ruin that had undone their predecessors. Some say they were defeated by invaders, others that civil war consumed them from within. Whatever the truth, their name would endure, whispered in awe by those who followed, for to be Toltec was not merely to belong to a vanished race, but to be a master of civilization itself. And so, in the final act of this grand prelude, there came the Mexica, the people history would know as the Aztecs. a wandering tribe of outcasts, dismissed as barbarians by those who had risen before them. They were led not by kings, but by prophecy. They sought a sign, a vision of an eagle perched upon a cactus, devouring a serpent. And when at last they found it upon the marshy shores of a great lake, they did what none before them had dared. Upon the waters of Lake Texcoco, they built an empire. Tenochtitlan, their great city, would rise in defiance of all expectation, a place of shimmering canals and towering temples, where warriors and priests ruled a domain stretching from ocean to ocean. If Rome was built upon the blood of its enemies, then the Mexica took this lesson to heart. Their gods demanded sacrifice, and the beating hearts of captives adorned their altars, a grim testament to the price of power. Yet the lesson of history is cruel and unchanging. That which rises must one day fall. The Mexica, for all their might, for all their dominion over the Valley of Mexico, were but the last and most glorious bloom of a garden that had seen countless flowers wither before them. They had defeated their rivals, bent the other city-states to their will, and filled their temples with the trophies of war. But they had also sown the seeds of their own destruction. Their vassals, resentful and oppressed, whispered of vengeance. Their belief in omens clouded their judgment, and far beyond the ocean, in lands unknown to them, a new force was stirring, a force unlike any they had faced before. Thus, as the sun set upon the ancient empires of Mexico, a new dawn approached. It would be heralded not by the plumed priests of Teotihuacan, nor the mathematicians of the Maya, nor the warriors of the Toltecs, nor even the blood-stained hands of the Mexica themselves. It would come upon the sails of foreign ships, carried by men who saw not an ancient civilization, but a prize ripe for the taking. The last and greatest chapter of Mesoamerican history had begun, and it would be written in fire, steel, and sorrow. It is one of the ironies of history that empires, for all their might and dominion, are often undone not by overwhelming force, but by the fatal flaw of their own design. The Mexica, who had built their empire upon conquest and tribute, believed themselves invincible, their gods unassailable, their warriors unmatched. They stood as lords of the Valley of Mexico, a people who had turned a swamp into a kingdom and a kingdom into a dominion stretching from ocean to ocean. Yet they had not accounted for the most treacherous enemy of all, history itself. In the year 1519, as their priests scoured the heavens for omens, as their emperor brooded upon his throne, their fate had already been sealed. Across the sea, in a world unknown to them, Spain had cast its gaze upon their riches, and the man who would deliver ruin to their doorstep had already set sail. Hernan Cortes, the architect of their destruction, was neither noble nor particularly pious. He was not a man of destiny ordained by heaven to shape the fate of nations, but a soldier of fortune, ambitious, cunning, and driven by the insatiable hunger for wealth and power that had become the hallmark of his countrymen. Spain, having expelled the Moors from her soil, now sought new lands to conquer, new infidels to subjugate. Gold was her god, conquest her creed, and the promise of an empire ripe for the taking was an opportunity too great to ignore. When Cortes landed upon the shores of the Yucatan, he did so not as an emissary, but as an invader. He burned his ships not as a testament to courage, but as a warning to his men. There would be no return without victory. The first battles were mere preludes to the great tragedy that would follow. The natives who first beheld the Spanish beheld them as gods, pale-skinned warriors clad in shining metal, mounted upon beasts that defied imagination, wielding weapons that spoke thunder and spat death. But it was not steel nor horses that would prove to be their most potent weapon. It was treachery. Cortez, ever the manipulator, understood what the Mexica had failed to grasp, that an empire built upon the resentment of its subjects is an empire built upon sand. He did not face the Mexica alone. He recruited their enemies, city-states that had long suffered beneath the yoke of their demands, men who were willing to betray their own rulers in exchange for revenge. The Tlaxcalans, fierce and embittered, became his allies. With their aid, the conquest of Mexico became not a war of foreigners against natives, but a war of Mexicans against themselves. When Cortez and his forces finally arrived at the gates of Tenochtitlan, they did so not as conquerors, but as guests. Montezuma, the tragic emperor of the Mexica, beheld the Spaniard with fear and fascination. His own priests had foretold the return of Quetzalcoatl, the god who would one day reclaim his throne, and in the Spaniard's arrival he saw the hand of fate itself. Was Cortez a man or a god? Was this an invasion or a divine reckoning? Paralyzed by doubt, Montezuma allowed the Spanish to enter his city unopposed, to walk the causeways of his great capital, to gaze upon the wealth of his empire. It was the gravest mistake of his reign. The Spaniards, having been welcomed as guests, quickly revealed their true nature. Montezuma, once the lord of an empire, became a prisoner in his own palace. His people, realizing the treachery too late, rose against the invaders. But steel and gunpowder were not the only weapons Spain had brought to these shores. Smallpox, that invisible harbinger of doom, spread through the city like wildfire. What swords could not accomplish, disease completed. The Mexica, weakened and leaderless, fought bravely, but their fate had already been decided the moment the first Spanish foot had touched their land. Cortez, however, was not invincible. The Mexica, though betrayed and outmatched, did not surrender easily. When the city finally erupted into revolt, the Spanish were forced to flee, stumbling through the streets, their armor weighing them down, their greed their undoing as they drowned in the very gold they had come to steal. This night of blood and desperation, known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, proved that even the mightiest of invaders could bleed. But if the Mexica thought they had driven their enemy away for good, they were mistaken. Cortez would return, and this time there would be no quarter given. The final siege of Tenochtitlan was not a battle, but an execution. The Spaniards, now reinforced, laid waste to the city with methodical cruelty. The canals ran red with blood, the temples were desecrated, and the people starved within their once mighty walls. Day by day, brick by brick, the city was torn apart. When at last the Mexicans surrendered, it was not because they had been defeated in battle, but because there was nothing left to defend. The city that had once been called the Venice of the New World was reduced to rubble. The empire that had ruled with iron and fear had been crushed beneath the same weapons it had wielded. Montezuma, the emperor who had hesitated when decisiveness was needed, died not in battle, but as a prisoner, struck down either by his own people or by his captors. History remains uncertain, and perhaps, in the grand scheme of things, it does not matter. His successor, Cuauhtémoc, fought with the bravery of a lion, but could not turn the tide of fate. Captured and tortured, he bore his suffering without a cry of pain, a final act of defiance against the men who had stolen his world. Thus ended the Mexica, not with a final stand of glory, but with a slow and suffocating death. Their temples were toppled, their gods cast down, their names reduced to whispers in the chronicles of their conquerors. Cortez, having forged an empire with cunning and cruelty, would find that conquest is often the easiest part of dominion. The Spanish would rule, but they would never truly be at peace. The flames of rebellion would never fully die. The ghosts of the fallen would haunt the land, their spirits lingering in the ruins of Tenochtitlan, whispering to the winds that the land was never Spain's to claim. For in the end, all conquerors become the conquered. Spain, in her arrogance, believed she had broken Mexico. She had not. She had merely given her another enemy to overthrow. The war was over, but history had only just begun. But revolution does not begin overnight. It festers in the hearts of the discontented, in the taverns where whispers of sedition grow louder, in the homes of the rich who dream of ruling what they see as rightfully theirs, and in the fields of the poor where hunger breeds desperation. For 3 centuries, Spain ruled Mexico as a conquered land, extracting its wealth, silencing its people, and believing that the chains they had forged were eternal. The seeds of revolution had been planted. The soil was rich with anger. The land that had once belonged to the Mexica, to the Maya, to the Toltecs, had been stolen but never truly surrendered. Spain, in her arrogance, had mistaken submission for loyalty, silence for acceptance. She had forgotten that an empire ruled by force is an empire built on borrowed time, and time, ever cruel, was running out. The viceroyalty, for all its grandeur and splendor, was but a castle built upon shifting sands. And in the darkness, beyond the sight of the viceroys and their gilded halls, a storm was gathering, a storm that would shake the very foundations of New Spain and bring an empire crashing to its knees. No empire, however gilded its facade, however absolute its power, can rule forever. Spain, having claimed Mexico as a vassal of her distant throne, had ruled for 3 centuries with an iron grip, extracting wealth, enforcing loyalty, and silencing dissent. But power is a treacherous master, and Spain had become blind to the forces she herself had set in motion. For beneath the surface of her colonial dominion, resentment festered. The land groaned under the weight of foreign rule, and the people, be they indigenous laborers, disenfranchised Criollos, or rebellious mestizos, had begun to dream of a world where Spain's chains no longer shackled them. The first whispers of rebellion did not come from the fringes of society, but from within its very core. The Criollos, Spanish by blood, but Mexican by birth, had long suffered beneath the condescension of the peninsulares. They were rich, they were educated, and yet they were treated as lesser beings by bureaucrats sent from Madrid. Spain, ever arrogant, had assumed that her American-born subjects would remain loyal, content to be the second sons of the empire. She had miscalculated. As the fires of revolution ignited across the Atlantic in the United States and France, the Criollos watched and learned. The old world was crumbling, and the tide of history could not be held back. It is one of the cruel ironies of history that Spain's own institutions, those she had placed to maintain order, would become the very spark of her undoing. On the morning of September 16, 1810, in the quiet town of Dolores, a priest named Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla rang the bells of his church and, with impassioned fervor, called his congregation not to prayer, but to war. His words, now immortalized as the Grito de Dolores, were not the speech of a scholar, nor the sermon of a pious clergyman. They were the cries of a man who had seen enough suffering, who had watched his people toil in servitude, who had decided that the moment had come to break the chains of Spanish rule. Hidalgo's rebellion was no orderly affair, no carefully planned conspiracy of generals and statesmen. It was a storm, raw and unbridled. The masses, peasants, farmers, and indigenous laborers flocked to his cause, driven less by ideology than by sheer desperation. They carried no muskets, wore no uniforms. They came armed with machetes, farming tools, and rage. Within weeks, this tide of fury surged across the land, sweeping aside Spanish garrisons, seizing towns, and leaving the authorities in a state of panic. The banner of the Virgin of Guadalupe, the very symbol Spain had used to pacify the indigenous, now became the flag of their liberation. Yet, for all its passion, the rebellion was doomed from the start. Hidalgo, a man of faith but not of war, led his armies with the fervor of a prophet, but the recklessness of a man who mistook momentum for strategy. His march to Mexico City, where victory seemed within grasp, was halted not by superior Spanish forces, but by hesitation. When he turned back, the opportunity was lost. The Spanish regrouped, and the rebellion was crushed. Hidalgo was captured, executed as a traitor, and his severed head was displayed in the city of Guanajuato as a warning to all who might dare to rise against the crown. But history does not belong to those who seek to silence it. The head of a martyr is no match for the memory of a cause. Hidalgo was dead, but his rebellion had lit a flame that could not be extinguished. What followed was not a single decisive war of independence, but a decade of chaos, betrayal, and shifting allegiances. The Spanish forces, though shaken, were still strong. The rebels, though inspired, lacked unity. The fight for Mexico's freedom became a war of attrition, fought in the mountains and jungles, in the deserts and plains, in ambushes and skirmishes where neither side could claim total victory. Men like Jose Maria Morelos, another priest-turned-warrior, rose to take Hidalgo's place. Morelos, unlike his predecessor, was a strategist. Under his leadership, the rebellion gained structure, discipline, and, for a time, real hope of success. His forces won battles, declared Mexico's independence in 1813, and drafted a constitution that envisioned a nation free from both Spain and the injustices of colonial rule. But Spain, though wounded, was not yet broken. Morelos, like Hidalgo before him, was captured, executed, and erased from official Spanish history, though never from the hearts of his people. The war dragged on. Leaders came and went. Vicente Guerrero, the mestizo general, carried the fight forward. Guerrilla fighters scattered across the land, harassed Spanish forces, striking and vanishing into the mountains. But it seemed as though Spain, battered yet stubborn, would never truly let go. As Spain faltered in Europe, weakened by its own internal struggles and the erosion of its global empire, cracks began to form in its hold over New Spain. The very men who had fought against the rebels, the Spanish loyalists, the conservative criollos, began to realize that their fate was no longer tied to a dying empire. Among them was Agustin de Iturbide, a royalist commander who had spent years fighting against independence. Yet in 1821, he did the unthinkable. He switched sides. With Iturbide's defection, the war was over in months. The rebels, exhausted but unbroken, joined forces with their former enemies. The Plan of Iguala was signed, promising an independent Mexico under a constitutional monarchy. The Spanish, seeing that their own loyalists had abandoned them, surrendered. On September 27, 1821, Iturbide marched triumphantly into Mexico City, not as a Spanish commander, but as the architect of independence. And so, after 300 years of Spanish rule, after 11 years of brutal warfare, after a sacrifice of countless lives, Mexico was free. But if the people had dreamed that independence would bring peace, they were sorely mistaken. Empires do not vanish without leaving ghosts in their wake. The new nation, barely born, stood upon fragile ground. Iturbide, having crowned himself emperor, proved as oppressive as the Spanish kings before him. The nation, fractured and divided, would plunge into civil war. The struggle for Mexico's soul had only just begun. Yet, for all its uncertainty, for all the turmoil that lay ahead, one truth remained unshaken. The yoke of Spain had been broken. The chains of empire had been cast off. And from the ashes of conquest, from the blood of revolution, Mexico had risen, not yet united, not yet whole, but undeniably, irreversibly free. Independence, long sought, fiercely fought for, and dearly won, did not bring the harmony that so many had envisioned. Mexico had thrown off the yoke of Spain, yet in doing so, it had inherited all the afflictions of a nation born from conquest and war. The country stood at a crossroads, free but fractured, victorious yet vulnerable, sovereign but unstable. The revolutionaries who had once marched under the same banner now turned against each other, not in the name of colonial subjugation, but in pursuit of their own visions for the newly born republic. What was Mexico to be? A monarchy where power rested in the hands of a ruler who would guide the nation like the kings of old. A republic governed by laws and institutions modeled after the United States. A federation where the provinces could govern themselves freely, or an authoritarian state where order would be maintained at all costs. These questions, left unanswered in the euphoria of independence, would haunt Mexico for decades to come. It is a peculiar irony of history that the man who had sealed Mexico's independence did so not to establish a republic, but to crown himself emperor. Agustin de Iturbide, once a royalist commander, had, in a stunning reversal, become the liberator of the nation. Yet his ambitions did not stop there. Inspired by the imperial grandeur of Napoleon and the divine right of kings, he saw himself not as a mere leader of a revolution, but as the monarch who would unite Mexico under his rule. On July 21st, 1822, he crowned himself Emperor Agustin I, a decision met with as much resistance as it was with celebration. His rule, however, was doomed from the start. The very people who had fought for independence, criollos, republicans, federalists, saw in Iturbide nothing more than a Spanish king in Mexican clothing. His lavish lifestyle, his suppression of dissent, and his failure to establish a stable government alienated even his former allies. By March 1823, his empire had crumbled. The very army that had once fought under his command turned against him, and he was forced to abdicate. Fleeing into exile, he made the fatal mistake of returning to Mexico in 1824, believing that the people would welcome him back. Instead, he was arrested and executed. His reign had lasted less than a year. With the fall of Iturbide, Mexico sought to establish a republic in earnest. In 1824, a new constitution of Mexico was written, inspired by the ideals of democracy and modeled after the United States. It established a federal system, granting power to individual states while creating a national government. The dream of a stable representative republic was now within reach. Yet, as history would so cruelly demonstrate, the reality of governance proved far more difficult than the ideals that had shaped it. The new nation was riddled with contradictions. It was a democracy in principle, but plagued by autocratic rulers, a federation in name, but dominated by centralists, a land of opportunity that still clung to the rigid class hierarchies of the colonial past. The great divide between federalists and centralists, liberals and conservatives, military strongmen and civilian politicians, turned the republic into a battlefield of ideas, each faction seeking to shape the nation in its own image. Even the presidency itself became a revolving door of chaos. Between 1824 and 1855, Mexico had over 50 different administrations, a carousel of leaders, coups d'etats, betrayals, and exiles. The country, rather than flourishing, fell into a cycle of political instability that left it vulnerable to both internal and external threats. In times of turmoil, strong men rise, and no figure in Mexico's early history loomed larger than Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, a man of infinite ambition, boundless cunning, and a chameleon-like ability to change allegiances. Santa Anna was not just a general, he was a force of nature. At times a hero, at times a dictator, he embodied the very chaos that defined Mexico in its early years. Santa Anna first emerged as a champion of the Republic, defeating a Spanish attempt to reconquer Mexico in 1829. He positioned himself as the great defender of the nation, winning the adoration of the masses. Yet, like all opportunists, he saw power as something to be seized, not merely granted. Over the coming decades, he would rule Mexico 11 times, shifting from liberal to conservative, from republican to autocrat, from national savior to national scourge. It was under Santa Anna that Mexico would suffer some of its greatest losses, none more devastating than the loss of Texas. Mexico, vast and sprawling, had inherited a land too large to govern. Nowhere was this clearer than in Texas, a northern province populated by American settlers who, despite living under Mexican rule, remained fiercely loyal to their own traditions, culture, and, most importantly, slavery, a practice that Mexico had abolished. By 1836, tensions boiled over. The Texas Revolution erupted, led by figures such as Sam Houston and Stephen F. Austin. Santa Anna, seeing the rebellion as an existential threat, led his armies north, determined to crush the uprising. He won a decisive but brutally infamous victory at the Alamo, yet his cruelty, executing prisoners, burning villages, only fueled the Texan cause. The war reached its climax at the Battle of San Jacinto, where Santa Anna, overconfident and reckless, was defeated and captured. In exchange for his life, he signed a treaty recognizing Texas as independent, a humiliating concession that Mexico would never formally acknowledge but could do little to reverse. With the loss of Texas, Mexico's vulnerability was exposed for the world to see. The United States, an expanding power hungry for land, saw in Mexico a weak and divided neighbor. The instability at home, the endless cycle of coups, and the failures of leadership made the country ripe for further dismemberment. Santa Anna, though exiled, would return again and again, always promising to restore order, always failing. By the time of the Mexican-American War, 1846, 1848, Mexico's fate was nearly sealed. The loss of Texas had been a warning. The loss of half the nation's territory was imminent. As Mexico stumbled into the abyss of war with the United States, it was clear that independence had not yet given birth to stability. The Republic was fragile, its leaders divided, and its future uncertain. The dream of a free and prosperous Mexico, so valiantly fought for in the wars of independence, was still just a dream. In the grand theater of Mexican history, few scenes are so richly adorned with irony and misplaced grandeur as the Second Empire. It was a moment when European vanity met Mexican volatility, and from their ill-starred union emerged an emperor more tragic than triumphant, a Habsburg prince adorned with illusions, enthroned by bayonets, and ultimately crowned by a firing squad. The curtain rises in the salons of Paris, not the streets of Mexico. Far removed from the dust and discontent of the Americas, Napoleon III, nephew of the original Bonaparte and heir to a fading imperial dream, cast his gaze across the Atlantic. Under the pretense of collecting debts and civilizing a barbarous republic, he dispatched troops to establish a puppet regime. But beneath the diplomatic veil lay a deeper ambition, to anchor French influence in the New World and to craft an empire where his own grandeur might echo through foreign lands. His chosen marionette was Ferdinand Maximilian of Habsburg, a man of refined manners, noble ideals, and catastrophic naivete. A second-born prince with no throne of his own, Maximilian accepted the Mexican crown with the zeal of a romantic and the judgment of a child. He arrived in Veracruz not as a liberator, but as a stranger clutching a crown bestowed by foreign cannons and conservative oligarchs desperate to halt the winds of republicanism. But the empire, like its emperor, was an illusion sustained by contradiction. Maximilian, imagining himself a benevolent ruler, declared liberal reforms that alienated his conservative supporters. He upheld land rights for indigenous peasants while relying on the very elites who had demanded their dispossession. His court imitated Vienna while his kingdom teetered between rebellion and bankruptcy. He built gardens and palaces while the provinces erupted in gunfire. The throne he sat upon was elegant, yes, but as unstable as the ground beneath it. The resistance, led by Benito Juarez, did not vanish with the empire's proclamation. It merely retreated into the mountains, smoldering like a dormant volcano, waiting for its moment to erupt. And that moment came, not through Mexican arms alone, but through the waning interest of European politics. Napoleon III, pressed by Prussian threats and diplomatic scorn, quietly withdrew his troops, abandoning his emperor to the mercy of his enemies and the logic of his own delusions. Maximilian, noble to the end and tragically oblivious, refused escape. He imagined martyrdom would ennoble his cause, that history would absolve his failure. But history, as it often does, responded not with reverence, but with cold finality. On a dusty hillside in Querétaro, beneath a gray and indifferent sky, Maximilian stood before a firing squad, not as a monarch, but as a man who mistook pageantry for power and ideals for strategy. His execution was not merely the end of an empire, it was the final act in a drama that had always been doomed. The crown of Mexico, borrowed from Europe, shattered beneath the weight of its own absurdity, and the people, whose voices had been ignored in the empire's grand overture, now watched its finale with a silence that spoke volumes. Thus ended the Second Empire, not with the clangor of glory, but with the echo of miscalculation. And in this chapter of Mexico's history, the irony is complete. A foreign prince came to rule, believing he would civilize a nation, only to be swallowed by the very forces he sought to command. A cautionary tale not merely for Mexico, but for all who mistake theatrical authority for legitimate power. After the final echo of imperial folly faded into the Mexican hills, the Republic emerged from its bruised slumber, disheveled, debt-ridden, but determined. Yet what followed was not a golden age of liberty, but an age of mirrors and masquerades, where tyranny wore the velvet glove of civilization and despotism spoke the language of reform. The architect of this elaborate illusion was Porfirio Diaz, a soldier by trade, a politician by instinct, and a master illusionist by necessity. Diaz first rose to prominence not through policy, but through rebellion, a general who had once fought under Juarez's banner only to later turn against the very institutions he helped restore. His seizure of power in 1876 was framed with elegant hypocrisy as a defense of democracy against the sin of presidential re-election. Yet once seated on the throne of the presidency, he would remain there for over 3 decades, re-elected by ballots that bore all the spontaneity of a military parade. Under Diaz, Mexico entered what historians, ever fond of euphemism, called the Porfiriato. It was a period of order, yes, and of progress, if one measures progress by the length of railways or the number of foreign investors sipping cognac in hacienda verandas. The cities gleamed with gas lamps, telegraphs clicked through the night, and European fashions strutted down the boulevards of Mexico City. To the foreign observer, Mexico appeared to have finally emerged from the shadows of revolution into the light of modernity. But beneath the polished veneer, the foundations cracked. The price of order was silence. The price of progress, suffering. The campesinos, those ancient stewards of the soil, found their lands swallowed by latifundios, vast estates ruled by absentee landlords and guarded by rural police whose primary skill was brutality. Wages stagnated, while the profits of modernization flowed into foreign coffers. The nation's mines yielded silver and copper not for national prosperity, but for the industrial appetites of London, Paris, and New York. Justice, too, was an ornament rather than an institution. The courts favored wealth, the press was muzzled with elegant censorship, and opposition was not debated but disappeared. The indigenous, once romanticized by reformers and vilified by conservatives, were now simply ignored, rendered invisible by a regime that measured citizenship not by heritage, but by economic utility. Diaz, ever the cunning statesman, understood the importance of spectacle. He filled his cabinet with technocrats, adopted the rhetoric of positivism, and welcomed foreign dignitaries to a republic that looked increasingly like a well-mannered autocracy. He dined with ambassadors while his political opponents rotted in prison cells. He commissioned statues to heroes of liberty while eroding the very liberties they had died to defend. And yet, perhaps the most fatal irony of all was Diaz's own success. For in constructing a machine of control so perfect, so efficient, so seemingly indestructible, he forgot the oldest lesson of power, that nothing ages faster than a regime that promises permanence. The people, denied voice and dignity for decades, began to whisper. Those whispers became murmurs, and the murmurs inevitably would rise into a roar. As the 20th century dawned, the old general, now draped in medals and illusions, stood atop a nation simmering beneath him. He had promised order and delivered repression. He had promised progress and delivered disparity. He had conquered revolution only to sow its seeds again, deep and furious, in the hearts of the oppressed. Thus ends the chapter, not with collapse, but with the quiet tightening of a spring coiled by injustice, tension, and time. A spring that, when released, would hurl Mexico into one of the most convulsive and blood-soaked upheavals in its history. The illusion of progress had dazzled for a generation. But illusions, however grand, cannot endure the weight of truth. And when the truth returned, it would do so with gunpowder and flame. The illusion had cracked. The gilded veneer of Porfirian order could no longer conceal the bitter truths buried beneath decades of oppression. And so, as if summoned by history itself, the revolution came, not as a single trumpet blast, but as a cacophony of rage, hope, betrayal, and idealism. It came not from a unified front of patriots, but from a fractured and fevered multitude, peasants and generals, dreamers and bandits, visionaries and opportunists, each bearing a different banner, yet all drawn by the same magnetic force, the promise of a new Mexico. At the center of this tempest stood Francisco de Madero, a figure both inspiring and tragically unprepared. A wealthy landowner turned reformer, Madero believed, naively some might say, that a corrupt regime could be toppled with ballots instead of bullets. His book, The Presidential Succession of 1910, denounced Diaz with refined indignation, and his call for democratic reform ignited hearts across the nation. Yet the old fox in the presidential palace dismissed him as a harmless eccentric. But Mexico was no longer deaf. When Diaz declared himself victor in yet another election, one as fraudulent as the last, Madero cried fraud and fled into exile. From the safety of San Antonio, he issued the Plan of San Luis Potosi, calling for rebellion. His words, simple but electrifying, found fertile ground in the parched soil of rural despair. What followed was not a revolution, but a mosaic of revolutions, each with its own cause, its own heroes, its own bloody logic. In the arid north, Francisco Pancho Villa, a former bandit with a taste for vengeance and showmanship, led ragtag armies of horsemen against Porfirian strongholds. In the fertile south, Emiliano Zapata, the stern-faced guardian of agrarian justice, raised the banner of Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty, fighting not for office, but for the ancestral lands stolen from his people. Meanwhile, Madero, triumphant, entered Mexico City in 1911 not as a conqueror, but as a reformer. Diaz, old and defeated, departed the capital in quiet disgrace, a fallen Caesar boarding a train into exile. And yet, even in victory, Madero was already out of place. He assumed that a corrupt system could be reformed through good intentions and moral example. But revolutions do not pause for decorum. The generals who had fought for him expected reward. The peasants who had bled for him expected land. And the enemies he had failed to purge plotted his ruin with quiet determination. The dagger came not from foreign invaders or open rebels, but from within his own military. In a grim echo of Roman betrayal, General Victoriano Huerta, a man who wore loyalty like a borrowed cloak, staged a coup that shattered the fragile dream. Madero, imprisoned and later executed, became a martyr, his death a grim prelude to the bloodbath yet to come. What followed was a brutal carousel of ambition and betrayal, a political dance macabre where leaders rose and fell with dizzying speed. Huerta's dictatorship collapsed under pressure from northern rebels, led by Venustiano Carranza, another constitutionalist in name, but a pragmatist in practice. Villa and Zapata, once hailed as heroes, now clashed with former allies. The revolution devoured its children with the same ferocity it had devoured its tyrants. The countryside burned, cities changed hands like playing cards. Ideals were proclaimed in manifestos and buried in mass graves. Each faction swore loyalty to the people even as they pillaged the people's homes. Each caudillo claimed to speak for the nation, even as the nation fractured further. And yet, amid the chaos, a strange and stubborn new order began to take shape. The Constitution of 1917, though born of war and compromise, enshrined principles that would echo through modern Mexican identity: land reform, labor rights, and the subordination of church to state. It was not the end of revolution, but the first attempt to contain it within the fragile framework of law. Still, the violence did not cease. Assassinations became the punctuation of political discourse. Zapata was ambushed and murdered in 1919, betrayed by false negotiations. Villa, though retired, was riddled with bullets in 1923. Mexico was not yet at peace. It merely staggered into exhaustion. By the 1920s, the revolution had not so much concluded as congealed into pragmatism. The idealism of the early days had given way to bureaucratic control and institutionalized power. The rhetoric remained, but the passion had been replaced with policy. The revolutionary dream, once pure and burning, had become a government. Thus ends the most violent chapter in Mexico's long drama, a revolution that promised everything, delivered some, and destroyed much. But in its tumult it gave birth to the Mexico that would stumble forward into the 20th century, scarred, complex, contradictory, and very much alive. When the dust of the revolution finally began to settle, Mexico was left with a nation scorched by ambition, wounded by betrayal, and yearning desperately for stability. But how do you rebuild a country that has bled from every corner? How do you form a republic from the wreckage of shattered ideals? The answer, as history would show, was not in returning to the past, but in engineering a new system of control, designed not around a single man, but around a machinery of power. From a chaos of revolutions emerged an unexpected creation, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI, a political entity that would rule Mexico with an iron grip wrapped in democratic silk for the next 7 decades. It was Plutarco Elias Calles, known as El Jefe Máximo, the Supreme Chief, who understood the need to institutionalize revolution. No more strong men rising and falling by the bullet. No more charismatic leaders swallowed by coups. The system had to survive, even if its leaders did not. In 1929, he helped form the National Revolutionary Party, the PRI's precursor, a party that would unify the factions of the revolution under one banner and one purpose: stability through continuity. Democracy existed on paper. Elections were held, candidates ran, and ballots were counted. Yet the real decisions were made behind closed doors, orchestrated by the invisible hand of the party machine. It was a system where presidents were chosen by succession, not popular will, and opposition, though permitted in form, was subdued in function. Ironically, it was a revolutionary government that perfected authoritarianism under a democratic mask. And yet, for all its contradictions, the PRI managed what no other regime had achieved in Mexican history: decades of uninterrupted governance, industrial growth, and the gradual formation of a national identity. Through mass education campaigns, the government fostered a unified language and history. Through agrarian reforms, peasants were granted lands, though often small and inefficient parcels. Through state-led industrialization, Mexico modernized. Cities expanded, highways connected regions, and a new working class emerged. The country transformed itself into a functional modern state, even as the shadows of corruption, censorship, and favoritism loomed ever present. Tensions simmered beneath the surface. Student protests in 1968, culminating in the horrific Tlatelolco massacre, shattered the illusion of harmony. The government, desperate to maintain its image ahead of the Olympic Games, opened fire on unarmed demonstrators, killing hundreds. The blood spilled in Mexico City's Plaza de las Tres Culturas was a stark reminder that the revolution's ghosts had never truly been laid to rest. In the decades that followed, cracks began to appear in the PRI's armor. Economic crises shook confidence. The peso collapsed. Public disillusionment grew. Opposition parties, once silenced, found their voice. By the 1990s, a political transformation was inevitable. In the year 2000, for the first time in 71 years, Mexico elected a president from outside the PRI. Vicente Fox, a former Coca-Cola executive and member of the Pawn Party, became the symbol of a new era, a democratic Mexico, free from the grip of its institutional past. The ghosts of the revolution still linger in the corridors of power. The legacy of land struggles, of centralized control, of the fight between the people and the powerful, continues to shape the country's present. Corruption, inequality, and violence remain daunting challenges. Yet so too does Mexico's resilience, its pride, its vibrant spirit, born from centuries of conquest, rebellion, and revolution. The Republic was forged not in peace, but in fire, and that fire still burns in the Mexican soul. History, that most unrelenting of judges, seldom grants absolution. It merely observes, records, and waits, casting its long shadow over every generation. And Mexico, a nation forged in conquest, baptized in revolution, and matured through contradiction, now stands before the mirror of time, not merely to admire its scars, but to decipher their meaning. It is no small irony that a land once ruled by stone calendars and blood rituals now contemplates its future through spreadsheets and satellite data. Yet beneath the sheen of skyscrapers and the hum of industry, Mexico's ancient pulse still beats. The rhythm of its past echoes in every village festival, every song sung in Nahuatl, every mural that adorns a government building, a living chronicle that refuses to fade. The question, then, is not merely what Mexico has become, but what it has remembered and what it has chosen to forget. For there lies the eternal struggle, a nation caught between the weight of its past and the promise of its future. In one hand, the legacy of majestic temples, colonial grandeur, and revolutionary fervor. In the other, the burdens of inequality, systemic corruption, and social fragmentation. The grandeur of its monuments coexists with the tragedy of its missing citizens, its impoverished communities, its silenced voices. Not because it is invincible, but because it is indomitable, a nation that has died and been reborn more times than history can count, and each time with more vigor, more color, more soul. Empires have risen and fallen, tyrants have marched and been overthrown. Ideologies have soared and collapsed. But the people, those eternal guardians of the land, remain proud, passionate, restless. In the face of global forces, migration, climate change, technological upheaval, Mexico confronts a new epoch. No longer the pawn of foreign empires, nor the captive of caudillos, it must now shape its own destiny, not in rebellion, but in wisdom. It must reconcile its ancient roots with its modern aspirations. It must remember that greatness lies not in monuments or flags, but in justice, dignity, and memory. Perhaps that is the final irony of Mexico's history, that in a land so defined by cycles of rise and ruin, the greatest revolution is not political, it is moral. And so, dear viewer, we conclude this grand chronicle not with a period, but a question. Will Mexico finally escape the eternal return of its own history, or has it, like all empires, merely changed its mask? Whatever the answer, one truth remains. Mexico is not merely a nation, it is a saga a living epic written in obsidian and ink, blood and song, tragedy and hope. And so, as the curtain gently falls on this grand narrative, one cannot help but feel the resonance of centuries vibrating through the soil of Mexico. From the sacred steps of Teotihuacan to the iron rails of Porfirian ambition, from the priestly cry of Hidalgo to the revolutionaries who bled in the dust, each epic, each actor, each tragedy has contributed to a tapestry so vast, so intricate, it defies mere chronology. Mexico's history is not a linear tale of progress, nor a singular epic of decline. It is a majestic spiral, ever circling back upon itself with new disguises, new hopes, new despairs. It is the ancient serpent devouring its own tail, the eagle forever poised above a serpent-strangled cactus, the eternal allegory of creation and destruction entwined. And what lesson can we extract from such a spectacle? That no empire is eternal, but every soul that dares to dream of justice is timeless. That every monument we raise in glory will one day be reclaimed by dust. But the ideas, the ideals, the struggles, they echo across generations. And perhaps the deepest irony of all, that while empires fall with the clang of swords or the hiss of ink on decrees, it is the quiet endurance of a people, their songs, their stories, their stubborn joy, that endures long after the banners have faded. So let this chronicle serve not merely as a recounting of battles and rulers, but as a mirror, held up not only to Mexico, but to all who seek to understand the strange cyclical theater of civilization. For in Mexico's rise and ruin, its grandeur and grief, we glimpse not only the story of a nation, but the very essence of humanity's eternal dance with power, pride, and purpose. Dear viewer, if you have walked with us this far, you're now a witness to this saga, a participant in its reflection. Carry it with you, question it, learn from it, and most of all, remember, the past is not a tomb, it is a guide, and those who dare to listen to its whispers may yet shape a wiser, brighter future. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the epic history of Mexico. If this story stirred your imagination, don't stop here. Watch our next video and continue exploring the wonders and wisdom of ancient civilizations. Let history not just inform you, but transform you, because time moves forward, but the truth always echoes.